Vocabulary is the foundation of all other language skills, but how should you learn Chinese words, characters, and character components? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about vocabulary in Chinese, and that of course means words, characters, and character components. For the month of December, there is a vocabulary challenge on. It starts on the 10th, and you can head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com if you are interested in that. It's completely free to join, and it's just a way to encourage you to study more. If you listen to this episode in the future, you can of course still head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com to see what challenges are on when you are listening. In any case, my goal is to make this episode useful even if you're not interested in the challenges, because what I will talk about is vocabulary learning in general. I've spent many episodes talking about fairly detailed things when it comes to learning Chinese words, characters, and character components, but today I want to make more of an overview, so look at how you can learn Chinese characters, maybe inside of this challenge and maybe in some other context. It really is up to you. So in this week's episode, I will talk about learning vocabulary in Chinese, and I will provide lots of links to further reading, but I will of course try to summarize the most important points here. So the first thing I want to bring up is meaningful learning, and that means that you should understand what you are doing. If you're trying to memorize something you don't understand and can't make sense of, that is much harder than trying to memorize something that you do understand and that makes sense to you. And if you're learning Chinese, you're in luck because most things in Chinese actually do make sense. It's just that maybe you don't have the knowledge to see how they make sense, but that just means that you need to learn a little bit more about how words are formed in Chinese, or maybe how characters are formed. And when you know this, you can make sense of the characters and the words, and they will be much easier to learn. If you do the opposite, which is usually called rote memorization, and rote here refers to brute force methods where you simply rely on repeating something over and over, that certainly can work, but it takes an awful amount of time, and it's also for most people rather boring. So I'd much rather learn something about characters, how they function, or about the words, how they are structured, and use that to my advantage, rather than trying to simply, say, write something over and over until it sticks. And having learned Chinese now for more than 15 years, I can also tell you that rote memorization of characters doesn't really work in the long run. You have to do a lot of it and you have to keep doing it, otherwise you will lose what you have learned. Whereas if you build a gradually deeper understanding of characters and how they work and do this in a smarter way, it requires much less time to maintain the knowledge of Chinese characters that you have built up. And I will talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but for now it's important to realize that if you understand what you're trying to learn, it gets easier. Okay, that's nice, but it also generates a follow-up question immediately. Where do you get this knowledge? Where do you get the knowledge that leads to understanding? And if you're a beginner, I'd like to recommend the character course that I built over at Skritter, which teaches you 150 characters, while also teaching you the most important things about how the writing system works, how characters are constructed, what types of characters there are, and so on. Normally, you can access the course during the 7-day free trial period, along with all the other features of Skritter, of course. But during the vocabulary challenge, you actually get a whole month for free, which is more than enough to go through the character course, which has 16 video episodes. If you want to learn more about the course, I talked about that in episode 110 of the podcast, and I'll put links to these things in the show notes. If you are not a beginner, or if you prefer to read, I have written a 6-part series about understanding the building blocks of Chinese. And again, I'll put links in the show notes, but the first article is called The Building Blocks of Chinese, Part 1, Chinese Characters and Words in a Nutshell. That's episode 54 in the podcast, but since these things are about characters, I think it makes sense to also read or at least refer to the images and visuals that are available in the article itself. This series isn't limited to characters only, but the 2 last articles are about word formation, and it isn't limited to beginners either, and I'm sure there are lots of things in there that should be interesting for you even as an advanced student. So let's recap. The most important thing here is that you understand what you're doing. If you regard Chinese characters as a jumble of random strokes, it will be almost impossible to learn lots of characters, but if you treat them as compounds consisting of meaningful components that are included because of some specific function in that compound, well, then it becomes a lot easier. So what I just said about understanding Chinese characters and the Chinese writing system is actually the first section in my article, My Best Advice for Learning Chinese Characters, and this is a huge collection of articles summarized to make them easy to overview. The second section deals with learning to read and write characters, and here we have more practical questions such as which characters and words you should learn. And for beginners, this usually means the most useful words, and those tend also to be the most common words, at least if you're staying close to the spoken language. And this is important because if you grab a random frequency list online, it will probably be based on written Chinese and not really contain the words you really need. And then, of course, there are a bunch of characters and words that are very useful for students or foreigners in particular, but maybe might not be that important or common in the language as a whole. And this is where textbooks and other materials written for beginners come in handy, because they have actually chosen characters and words that they think are useful, and it makes sense to study those. Then, of course, there will always be things that you as an individual want to learn because you're interested, because it's about your profession or your interest in Chinese or something like that. And you should always add those things. I'm not saying you should only stick with the most common things in the language or the most useful one for students in general. Of course, you should use your interests, hobbies, and so on. As you leave the beginner level and become a more advanced student, the proportions here should shift, so you should use much less of materials that other people have created for you and just use more of what you think you need yourself. And if you read a lot and you listen a lot to things that you're interested in or things you want to be able to read and listen to in Chinese, you will naturally come across the language you need, and that should be the main source of the words you are learning. It shouldn't just be something you download in a list on the internet, but instead make sure you read and listen a lot, and you will have plenty of words to learn. Of course, you can also learn characters and words simply by reading and listening. You don't actually have to study vocabulary explicitly as such, although in my experience this can help greatly. And here I want to make it very clear that even though I am recommending that you spend time explicitly with vocabulary, such as using flashcards and the like, because this has shown to be very efficient indeed, I don't mean that that's the only thing you can do. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that the language consists of words, so if you learn all the words, you will be fine. This is not how it works. Learning vocabulary is only a small part, and it should be a springboard to something else. And if you learn words, that will enable you to read a lot, and it will enable you to listen to a lot. And if you hadn't learned these words, reading and listening to these materials would be a pain. And now that you have studied more words, it will be much easier. But if you don't combine vocabulary learning with loads of listening and reading, it doesn't really work, and you will end up with a flashcard deck of 25,000 words without even being able to have a conversation. So yes to explicit vocabulary learning, especially for adult independent learners, but no to this being the main thing you're doing, or indeed the only thing you're doing. The third section in my article about the best advice for learning Chinese vocabulary is about reviewing and remembering Chinese characters and words. There are many things that work well here, such as flashcards and spaced repetition, and normally these are presented in combination, so you have a flashcard app that also uses spaced repetition, and this works really well. Of course, like I just said, this doesn't work if it's the only thing you're doing, but it works very well as support for your listening and reading, and indeed speaking and writing. It's also worthwhile spending a little bit time understanding how your memory works. And this is because many people see memory as being something innate that cannot be changed, and this is simply not right. There are many techniques and skills that can be fairly easily acquired that will boost your ability to remember things tremendously. And this is not a sales trick or anything. There are really simple techniques that will boost your memory a lot. And these can, of course, be applied to Chinese characters and words as well. Next, I want to talk about a set of techniques that I find very useful for keeping characters separate. Because indeed, when you have learned a number of characters and you're maybe an intermediate or even advanced learner, the most difficult thing with learning vocabulary in Chinese is actually not to learn new things, to commit new things to memory. That's fairly trivial, to be honest. When you've figured out how the writing system works, you have all the components and building blocks, learning something new isn't all that hard. Unfortunately, the thing that does get harder with time is keeping all these things separate. And this is where these three techniques come in. So the first one is to zoom in. So if you have a character you're struggling with or a word you're struggling with, zooming in refers to moving to a smaller layer, as it were. So if you're looking at a character, it means zooming into the components. And if you're looking at a word, it means zooming into the component characters in that word. And by understanding the building blocks, it will be easier to understand the whole as well, as I said in the beginning when we talked about meaningful learning. The other process is zooming out, which is the opposite then. It's not about understanding how something is built, but rather about understanding it in context. How does it work? What words does this character appear in? What other characters does this component appear in? And so on. And here you need specific tools to do this well, and I'll provide links in the description again to articles where I discuss these things. And the final technique in this set is panning, so that will refer to sideways movement. So, for example, if you're looking at characters, it would mean comparing similar characters to each other. This is one of my pet peeves when it comes to vocabulary acquisition and teaching, because it has been shown over and over that teaching similar things at once is a really bad idea. So, for example, learning a list of 10 fruit at the same time is not a good thing. And learning, say, 会, 能, and 可以 for can at the same time is not a good way to learn things either. This doesn't mean that you should never compare and contrast words with each other, of course. It just means that you shouldn't do so initially when you first learn them. But if you've learned these 3 words for can in Chinese, and then you say to yourself, I seem to be mixing these up, let's figure out what they do. And that's panning. You're comparing similar things on a similar level and trying to figure out what the differences are. This is sometimes rather easy to do, you just need to look in a dictionary, but sometimes it can be rather complicated, as in the case with 会, 能, and 可以. So these 3 techniques of zooming in, zooming out, and panning are things that I usually do when I struggle with a character or a word for some reason. So instead of banging my head against this character over and over, I instead try to really understand it. I try to understand its place in the web of Chinese, as it were, and I try to see what I've misunderstood or if there are any clues that will make it easier for me to remember this. And if there aren't any, usually I can still make something up that is helpful. It's important that you don't use the banging your head against something until it works strategy here, because like I said earlier, this actually can work in the short term, but it tends to really break down in the long term. A good example of this is what's normally called leeches, and this is a term used in Anki. I'm not sure where it's from originally, maybe from SuperMemo or maybe somewhere else. But a leech is something obviously that sucks blood out of you and it drains your energy. And in this case, it's applied to words that you get wrong over and over. And these tend to be fairly random, as in I cannot see why a specific word is difficult sometimes. But in Anki, for example, you can sort words by how many times you've gotten them wrong. And I haven't used Anki actively for many years now, but when I did use it and I checked which words I had forgotten the most, it turned out that there were a few I had forgotten almost 100 times. And this is clearly ridiculous. 100 times is a lot. And that also means that between those 100 times, I probably did remember it many times. So it's likely that some words and characters took me hundreds and hundreds of repetitions to actually learn. And I don't mean learn as in thoroughly understand how it's used in context and so on, because obviously that requires a lot of reading and listening and exposure to this particular word. I just mean the basic definition and form, as in pronunciation and how it's written, of a single word, and that should not take hundreds of repetitions. So what you should do is that you should be on the lookout for these things. So even if your app or flashcard thing doesn't have a function that allows you to show these leeches and do something with them, you can still mentally be on the lookout for them. So maybe you stumble on a word and you say, hey, I've gotten this wrong several times now, it seems. It seems to always occur, and then I forget how to write it or how to pronounce it or something. Take it out of the queue, pause it, do something with it, and look at it in detail later. Study the character, zoom in, zoom out, pan, figure out what the problem is. I actually wrote an article detailing the process of this after a previous vocabulary challenge where I took 7 mistakes that I made with Chinese characters and really traced them to the source and tried to figure out what I did wrong and what I could do to avoid that problem in the future. As usual, I'll include links to this in the description of this episode. So now we've gone through a few things you should consider when it comes to learning vocabulary in Chinese in general, but I do also want to say a few things specific to challenges of different kinds. And you can apply this to your everyday learning if you want, or to this particular challenge if you want. It doesn't really matter. But goals are important. If I don't have a challenge and I don't have a goal, I tend to neglect vocabulary learning. Well, if I have very strong habits, that's a good thing, and you can usually rely on those to get a lot of studying done anyway. But if you want to do something out of the ordinary and radically increase your, say, vocabulary acquisition or something like that, you need a goal and you need a period to achieve it in, some kind of deadline. And this is why I think Hacking Chinese challenges are useful, I mean for me as well, to learn more. Because there is a fixed time span, I set a goal, and I do my best to reach that goal. So a couple of things to keep in mind here is that you should try to choose a goal that is ambitious but not impossible. So if it's too high, I mean, let's say you want to learn 10,000 words in a month, that's probably not possible even if you study full time. And that means that you don't really own this goal. It's something that you just said and you don't really believe. You can't see yourself achieving this goal, and you probably won't. That example was maybe a little bit ridiculous, but let's say you work full-time and you have a family, then saying that you're going to spend 2 hours a day learning vocabulary is equally improbable and you will probably fail. The opposite is also true though, that if you set a goal that is too low, it feels easy and you're not actually pushing yourself at all, and then there is little point of having a challenge in the first place. So try to find something you think is reasonable. And for the challenges, I recommend maybe 30 minutes a day for people who study seriously, and of course less if you're studying only part-time. I also recommend that you announce the goal of your challenge to other people, maybe on social media, and of course if you do, you should tag Hacking Chinese. But you can also do it to family or friends and say, I'm going to do this and I want you to check in on me, at least at the end, but preferably also along the way. And this means you've committed to something in public, and that makes at least me much more likely to get these things done. This probably works for most people because, well, humans are social beings and we want to maintain our status in the wider community. And if you commit to doing things and you don't do them, people will not think highly of you, so you try to avoid that. This doesn't have to be framed in a negative way like I just did. It could also just be that when you are in a challenge with other people who are facing the same struggles as you are, it just makes it a little bit more easy to invest that extra effort that is required to reach your goal. So if this sounds interesting, head over to Hacking Chinese Challenges and enroll for the challenge. And like I said at the beginning, if you're listening to this in the future, you're still welcome to go to challenges.hackingchinese.com and see what challenges are available when you are listening. Good luck and happy studying! Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.